All right. Hello, everybody, and welcome to day 24 of 28 days to master level chess tactics. So, I'm going to cover in the next 3 days, we're going to go through clearance because clearance is also a very important tactical pattern. Now, of course, clearance can get simple, but it can also get very complicated in terms of applying the main goal in your calculations. So let's just start with a rather simple example. This is black to move, and you can pause the video now. Let's get into it. So in this position, let's go through the material here. So black is down. It looks like two pawns. We have four, or I guess one pawn. It looks like otherwise material is equal, although you can see that black is much more active, although he does have some weaknesses. The knights are in contact here. This pawn is rather weak, and it looks like the rook is quite active, and that's kind of the defining feature of this position. So white's rook is just sitting here on f1, and it really should be in the game somehow, either in the center or at least on an open file, but it's not really doing anything, and these two minor pieces are rather discoordinated. So let's see how black punishes that. You look for forcing variations. Now, in clearance tactics, what you're trying to do is you're trying to basically clear a line or a diagonal, and that will lead normally to mating attacks against the king. Now, it can also lead to wins of material, but in these two examples, they're basically mating attacks against the king. Because why would you want to forcefully give away a piece to open a line unless you're basically trying to mate the king? So let's see how that happens here. So with knight takes, that's the most obvious idea in this position because the bishop is supporting a mate on h2 and the rook is ready to swing over on the fourth rank. So if the pawn takes, then basically you would actually check, and if the king can't go here to protect the pawn because the bishop's covering it, so he has to go over, and then you would just simply take, and there's no protection because this pawn is blocking it. Pawns aren't the soul of chess, as I keep saying. The pieces are. All right, so what if he doesn't take here? Or what if he does take? Well, if he takes here, you definitely don't want to take with check, but actually that clears another line, and now the black queen can come in and deliver checkmate on h2 with the rook being a deciding feature of that checkmate. Now the king can't move over because it's just sitting there. All right, so basically from the beginning of this position, you can see that the idea of sacrificing a piece results in a clearance of a line, and then there's a second check that so it's basically two clearances in one. You have a knight clearance to clear the G file, and then eventually a rook clearance to clear the H file. So I thought this was a perfect example of a higher level clearance. All right, let's get on to position 2. All right, in this position, it's rather crazy. It's white to move, and you can pause the video now to look at it. All right, so the material, it looks like white has an extra pawn, but he is down in exchange, and it looks like black has quite a lot of piece activity, at least with the knight and the queen. He's ready to just check, and I guess you'd have to calculate it, but it actually looks like a really dangerous situation with check and a knight check. So basically, you're going to have to do something very forcing in this situation. Now, the queen would love to check here, but the pawn can take it, so you have to calculate if that works or not. There's also knight check here, and you'd have to calculate those. All right, so the knight check here, it looks like the king can just go over, and the knight check here, the king just goes over, and then you don't really have anything forcing after that, and then you really have to worry about protecting this square somehow. And of course, if he moves the pawn, then there's also a check here, and that's kind of hard to defend against. I guess he could bring the knight in, and that could do something. But let's look at even more forcing variations. So queen to g5. That's actually the correct move, and it's actually a long-range clearance. This is why I chose this as a second position, because it's a little harder to see. So if the pawn takes, you check, and you have to see that the two knights, especially this tactical pattern with the two knights in this arrangement, two squares apart, this actually controls so many squares against the king. The knight is controlling this square, and this knight is controlling these squares. So that the king is basically forced into the corner. And then all you'd have to do is check this bishop check, which is a little hard to see because of the long range. And then there's no piece, none of these three pieces can interpose, and the only inner position is rook to f6, bishop takes, and now the knight's covering here, and the bishop is checking, and the king is checkmated. So a very interesting clearance along a diagonal, and it's actually, let's go back to the beginning of this position. It actually results just from forcing moves, and this is why you should first evaluate the general ideas of the position, see what your opponent's threatening, and then really go deep into any forcing moves, even if they look crazy, like queen to g5, pawn takes. You might think, okay, well, the pawn can just take my queen, and many players would just end their calculation there. But you also have to kind of apply basic tactics, especially long-range bishop diagonal checks, which are, hard to see even if you know a pattern, but you need to really think about that when you're applying in your calculation. All right, so this concludes day 24. We're going to cover 2 more days of clearance, a very important tactic, and I'll see you in day 25. Thanks for watching. Don't fret if you got the solution wrong. There will be another time.